I have here before me a couple pages of handwriting I was doing in a particularly elated state yesterday, which I haven't read back. So I'll see in a few moments whether or not there's any integrity between the me that is now speaking and the person which was attempting to write something yesterday. Okay? Isn't that always the way? I don't know if you guys experienced that. Probably not, given you both write an awful lot more than me. Well, it really is an honor to introduce you both, welcome you both. This is a conversation that's been motivated by many themes we've been in exploration with in the Voicecraft context, as indeed you both have in your own work. Different conversations in the Value and Civilization series, as well deep interests in understanding what it means to participate in transformation. This is really key for me. Somewhere in relation to there are some of Daniel's ongoing thoughts as to the importance of intrinsic motivation in relation to economics. There's an emphasis, Matt, in your work on the importance of phenomenology and how the human, in the sense of embodiment, in the sense of awareness and what it means to participate in cosmos, can home itself and connect ourselves in the context of a cosmic picture that makes sense. And of course, as soon as we open ourselves to such breadth, there's a lot of room for conjecture. And maybe that's why people are opting in for relationships with AI perhaps these days, rather than meet the shocking difference of what it is to be a human being attempting to relate with meaning, order, and disorder in the cosmos. Perhaps not. But there's a lot here. Part of what grounds this inquiry for me really is something like the question, what degrees of freedom are open to us at the moment in culture that can hold firm and reconnect and orient from a footing and a place of the creation of value in exchange. There's probably a more simple way to word that as a question, but perhaps with that as a broad opening, this really is just about opening up the stage really to you both. I might just invite Daniel, if you'd like to share anything in relation to opening up this conversation. You have a sense of some of what I'm interested here in relation to connecting how it is that economics and what it might mean to participate more deeply in life have perhaps come apart, and how they might come back together, maybe for the sake of a conscious, sustainable civilization, if that's not too much.
Well, delightful. It's a pleasure to be here. And Matt, it's wonderful to have a chance to speak and meet you. And Tim, always a delight to be here. I think it is interesting to ask questions of degrees of freedom. One of the things that make us ask about freedom is when we encounter something that doesn't seem like it's working, or it's encountering certain limitations of what can continue without becoming self-devouring, or a word I like to use is auto-cannibalistic, where it starts eating itself. And so when you come to that place where you say, man, if we keep going down this hallway, either you're going to keep going into various forms of reductionism, nihilism, meaning crisis, stagnations, inequality, a lack of innovation. Surely there must be a different way. And it's precisely when you start to encounter, and it becomes increasingly blatant that you're facing that sort of horizon, that we can begin asking questions of freedom. And I think, many people will talk about the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, nihilism, and so on and so forth. It's precisely if it opens up those inquiries of what might be possible when faced that, then it can actually be a wonderful opportunity. But we do have to engage in asking those questions and looking for different possibilities. So I appreciate that framing. Economics is very interesting. I'm always taken by, you'll be reading along like in a Stiglitz, and they'll say, man, creativity sure is important. Too bad we have no idea how to generate it, and proceed to go on to talking about supply and demand. You'll read something like in Keynes with the general theory, which Belonging again we'll talk about, on the notion of, if demand runs out in the economy, it's really hard to recover it. and we seem to need to be able to stimulate demand. Oh, but eventually those methods of stimulation seem to wear down. The economy begins to slow. The inequality begins to increase. You have the middle class dwindle. Well, just keep stimulating it. Well, what's this demand thing we're stimulating it? Well, it's there. Whatever it is, just stimulate it, and we'll see what occurs. And eventually it wears out, and you have people like Piketty talking about the growth of asset values always exceeding the growth of wealth. There's a particular thinker I thought I would bring up because he's very interesting. He won the Nobel Prize maybe in the 50s. His name is Robert Solow. I believe it is Solow. And he's a fascinating thinker because he was asking the question of what gives rise to long-term stable growth. And most economists up to that point, and you could argue still to this very day, are going to talk about things like generally labor, capital, increases of productivity, stuff like that, trying to maintain marginal utility, so on and so forth. And what Robert, Solow finds is it's something called the Solow residue, I believe. And what's very funny is it finds that if you go through and you look at all of the movements of capital or the movements of labor, there's about 20 to 50% of the economy you can't explain. Productivity. It's it's kind of like they trace out this crater, like you're walking around the crater of an asteroid and there's this big hole in the middle. Somewhere between 20 to 50% of the growth or productivity of the economy cannot be explained simply through labor or capital. He puts it as technology and basically creativity or people generating new forms to have productivity, which is very interesting because you can't quite model those things. And yet they tend to make up a really large proportion of what your economy is. This is very interesting because it would suggest that there's basically something profoundly missing from our thinking of economics. And we'll talk again about the question not of merely stimulating demand, but creating demand. And basically, I think if we look at Robert closely, it suggests that the question of creativity and what creativity is actually incredibly consequential for economics, and that we haven't thought it because basically we've assumed it's random, it's beyond our modeling, and it seems to just be that maybe if we just find a better model, we'll get away from it. We'll be able to finally sort of bring this thing into the internal consistency of our economy. I really connect with Matt's work, and then I'll just bring these opening statements to a close because there's this real emphasis on creativity as a metaphysical construct, like really deep in what makes human beings, and what makes the universe what it is. And funny enough, you actually see that going on in economics. That economics actually provides a kind of case study to show that what actually generates wealth is this ultimate organic principle that cannot be rendered completely into the models, and yet we tend to act like it can be. And we tend to kind of disown it and disavow it and pretend like it can't be that important. Or if it is important, we can always assume it. There's always some percentage of entrepreneurship, some percentage of innovation, some percentage of creativity. Well, there's a lot of economists now, like Keynes warned about the great stagnation. You have Tyler Cohn talking about the great stagnation, where you seem to have economic growth slowing, which then creates an incentive to consume, to re-stimulate it, but this becomes unsustainable with the environment, right? But if you don't know how to create wealth, just stimulate wealth, then you have to incentivize further the habits of consumption that are ultimately unsustainable, destroy the environment, just lead to techno-feudalism, as someone like that gentleman says, whose name I cannot pronounce, forgive me, and you have the reemergence of an oligarchy. There's another book called The Great Leveling in Studebaker. The great Studebaker was talking about this. And in that book, he talks about where if you go through the history of economics, you find that basically the only times you avoid oligarchies or monopoly power is you either need something like a war, a plague, a revolution, or an environmental disaster. And that tends to cause a great leveling. You get a growing middle class, but then it goes back to an oligarchy. And basically, my point is this. There is good reason to think from economics that if we don't make creativity central, if we don't actually think it and bring it into our modeling and really focus on a human element, we will just continue to go into these directions of unsustainable economic activity that ultimately lead to a growth that just becomes eating its own tail. And it can't even sustain itself. And then I think the other claim is that when human beings actually do figure out how to motivate themselves according to creativity, not merely consumption, they also are happier. And something like GDP comes to represent well-being, not merely economic productivity that has been separated from a creative origin. So I think thinking Whitehead, which again, Mr. Segall is an expert on these thinkers, Steiner, Whitehead, Bergson, that sort of metaphysics. That metaphysics is actually, there is an opening, if you will, in the solo residual for bringing in that metaphysics and thinking economics according to it. And if we do not, we will probably continue to suffer a stagnation, reemergence of oligarchies where we just wait for the next war or catastrophe to give us a second chance. I would like to think of a new way to do economics than waiting for the next catastrophe. Creativity seems like a better road. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And Tim, for getting us rolling on these questions. I mean, the first thing I think to frame my remarks would be to say that over the last, several decades of my adult life and thinking about economics and finding my way politically to thoughts that I like to think are my own and not just some ideology I've absorbed in an attempt to become part of some group that will accept me and where I can feel like I belong. Belonging is very important, and I think ideology very often has to do with where we find ourselves belonging, and we speak the way that the people we belong to want us to speak. But the problem for me as I sort of drifted away from something more or less like socialism as the answer to all of the problems was that, the question is, how do we get to where we'd like to be from where we are? And that kind of revolutionary energy that says all of this is wrong, let's just burn it all down and start fresh is a kind of youthful energy. And we need young people to have that attitude because it keeps the society on its toes. But that might actually leave things, if we were to actually have a revolution, might leave things way worse than they are now, which would be hard to imagine, but it could get much, much worse in terms of how the economy functions, how society functions. And so I guess this is the pragmatist in me that wants to figure out how do you get there from here, and how do you not saw off the branch that you're perched upon as you do so? And all of our critiques of existing economic forms and social forms are valid and important in many cases, but we also need to be constructive, and we need to build from where we are in a realistic way. So all that said, business as usual is going to get everybody killed. I like to think of economics as a subset of ecology. And Daniel, you mentioned some of my influences. Another important influence on me here is Thomas Berry, who's often referred to as a geologian. He was a Catholic priest, but began to study ecology and cosmology and ended up collaborating with a cosmologist named Brian Swim, who was a teacher of mine. I never met Thomas Berry, but I feel as though I'm in his lineage because Brian Swim is a teacher of mine. And what Thomas Berry suggests is that ecology is really one way of understanding what it means is it's a functional cosmology. And so how we engage with the energy flows and the other organisms that share this planet with us is going to be a function of our cosmovision, of our worldview, what we think the universe is and what the human place within it is. And downstream of all of that is economics. So economics, the human economy, is a subset of the Earth's ecology. Now, human beings have come to play a rather outsized role in this Earth ecology, in this community of life on the planet. And I was just seeing this graphic the other day about the amount of human created stuff, everything from concrete to metals to plastic and so on. And basically all of the human mass that has been created is now equal to the rest of the biomass of the planet. So we are now, this is the Anthropocene because human beings have become a geological force on par with supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts. And
And so, when we ask these questions about economics and how to model the economy, how to think about supply and demand, how to engage creatively with the role that disruptive technologies play and all of that, I think it's important to keep this larger context in mind. I mean, the cosmological frame is one that you invited us to consider, Tim. And so when we place economics in this context, what becomes immediately relevant, I think, is this distinction between, when you talked about demand, Daniel, we can distinguish between human needs and human wants, human desires. And most, at least in the developed world, most of our needs are met. There's tremendous inequality, but in terms of food production, in terms of the amount of housing that's there available, all human needs could be met easily. There's a distribution problem and there's an inequality problem that prevents those needs from being met, I would say. But we're mostly in an economy now that's trying to grow, as you were suggesting, Daniel, by increasing and inventing new human desires to feed patterns of consumption that I would say actually take us further and further away from healthy human being. I saw an ad the other day, which I initially thought must be parody, for a new device called Friend. You wear this little pendant on your neck, and it listens to everything you say, and it's an AI, right? And it texts you as a friend would, just to try to cheer you up, make you feel less lonely. And I can't tell you how much more lonely I felt after watching this ad. It's not a parody. This is a real product, apparently. And so this is the type of economy, the type of product that is increasingly going to be, I think, driving us away from real human connection and driving us away from paying attention to the world that we're destroying. Now, creativity is very important. I'm not a Luddite. I think technology is exciting. I I I can also see the way in which it functions as a new kind of uh, religion. Um, the way in which this idea of endless technological progress is part of what keeps uh, our society, our modern society, motivated. That, oh, well, maybe the future will be better because we'll invent the new thing that will solve that problem. And climate change, yeah, we'll just, some technology will change it, we'll fix it, and we won't have to change our consumption habits. Um, and so I think I don't want to sound like technological progress isn't a possibility and doesn't occur, but it's not the solution to our problems. But in some sense, human economics has always been about the application of intelligence to nature to generate surpluses, right? And again, we have already more than enough technology to meet all of our needs. And so what are we doing? And I think in large part, modern economic theories have really emphasized human vices and ignored human virtues. In other words, models treat human beings like selfish agents trying to maximize return on investment, maximize profit. They were constantly calculating, how can I get more? And that is a self-fulfilling prophecy because everyone assumes everyone else is behaving in that way. And so, we get a society that becomes increasingly atomized and selfish. And we think of human beings just by virtue of the lowest common denominator, that just in terms of our selfishness, and we downplay our virtues. We downplay the extent to which actually people like to cooperate with one another. We like to associate with one another. We like to be helpful. We naturally feel a sense of sympathy for others. We want to help, but we don't have an economy where that virtuous side of our humanity is encouraged or fostered. Quite the opposite. And one last thing I'll share here, just to get things rolling, is in terms of creativity. I think I really appreciate what you were saying, Daniel, about the importance of a metaphysics rooted in creativity and how our economic models have not understood it well. But in putting the human economy within the context of the Earth's ecology. And, of course, the Earth is part of a larger circuit with the sun and feeding us energy and everything. But, the Earth system is this organism, and we're a part of that. There's a tendency, though, on among environmentalists and the environmentalist left particularly, to imagine that nature is some sort of a harmonious, steady state system, and that it's human beings that have come in and disrupted all of that. And I really appreciate, Slavoj Žižek's approach to this question, where, he'll remind people that actually the history of life on this planet is a series of cascading catastrophes. This is the sixth great mass extinction event. Yes, this time precipitated by industrial civilization. There have been 5 prior. We weren't here. So we're not the source of all of the disruption of this planet. But rather than thinking of it as just catastrophe after catastrophe, this is the nature of creativity. It always comes with destruction. After every one of these prior mass extinctions, there was more diversification of life. More species emerged a few million years later than had existed prior, right? So that's the creative nature of life on this planet. And so when we're trying to imagine not just a more sustainable economy, but a regenerative economy, I think we need to get over this idea that's, quite popular among the environmental left, that human beings can only mess things up. We have a role to play on this planet, a creative role to play, and we could enhance life, and our economy could be regenerative. It's just a matter of giving birth to a new worldview. And, I'm not an expert in how you should go about doing that. Cultural transformation is quite mysterious. Look at the birth of new religions. What catches fire in people's souls is not something that you could have an algorithm that would help you predict. It's not something AI is ever going to understand, though AI is probably going to give rise to new religions. I mean, it already is. And so I think ultimately we would need an economic model, an economic approach that acknowledges the full spectrum of human capacities, both our vices and our virtues, that acknowledges that creativity comes with destruction, and that the natural world is not just this perfect, harmonious place, and that human beings belong on this earth. We have a role to play on this earth. But we really need to acknowledge also that economics is not everything. There are so many things that are nowadays in our kind of neoliberal capitalist context that are considered to be something that the market should, that are part of the marketplace, part of the capitalist economy, that I really don't think should be part of the capitalist economy. We don't want to stymie and stifle innovation, but at the same time, I'm not sure that things like food production, healthcare, education, even government, increasingly, you just buy politicians now, and it's out in the open. Like, there's certain things that belong in different spheres of human life and that aren't best considered as functions of the economy. And I think that cuts against the logic of this ever expanding market logic that has come to dominate the planet. I mean, even in formerly communist countries, this logic of the market has continued to spread. And I don't think the consequences of that have been positive. And we could talk about these charts that you'll see and these arguments about how many people capitalism has lifted out of poverty. But I think it depends how you look at it. You could think a subsistence lifestyle, living close to the land, embedded in community, is impoverished. But and on the other hand, people living alone at jobs they hate in the middle of a big city, making 50, 60, 70, $100,000 a year might also be impoverished in a different way, right? Qualitatively speaking, even if quantitatively they're making more money. So played out a lot, but that's what's on my mind as we begin this topic.
Yeah, thank you guys. On that last point, Matt, I think that's why, for any of those listening who might be wondering, why it's the cosmic order. What do I even mean by that? Just sort of gesturing, in a sense, to the grandness within which, or in effect, which constitutes a core conditionality for our belonging, of our belonging. And so when we think about the relationship between quality and quantity, having more money and less money, but then recognizing that that might have very little to do with one's felt sense of belonging in the context of a local ecology, in the context of a community, all these types of things. That's partly the gesture there, is that there are critically, there is a reality that is beyond the, let's say, constructed, emergent constructed order of our time, which, whatever we are constructing and exchanging in relation, remains beholden to in a number of different ways. And so, okay, there's a lot there. I'll pass it back over to Daniel.
Brilliant. I love everything Matt said. It was wonderful. So a few things come to mind. On the subsistence point, there's a thinker, his name's Ivan Illich, and he made the point that the problem about modern civilization is it disables you in certain trade-offs. So for example, we have a food lion. You can go to the grocery store and get food. And because you can get food, you don't realize you've lost the ability to hunt. So you're disabled, but you don't notice it because you have access to the food. And so there's always this kind of trade-off. And as a result, the argument he makes is that modern economics actually kind of needs, he's very inspired by a thinker named Paul Planier, who wrote a book called The Great Transformation, that argues that market economies only work if you make market societies, that you have to socialize people in a certain way so that a certain mode of the market, let's say capitalism, is intelligible to them. Because if it's not intelligible to them, it will not work. And this is very important because it means that the step of socializing people to certain ways of acting and valuing is not necessarily going to follow simply from introducing a new market. They have to be talked into it. The government has to pass certain rules, and when those rules are part, the architecture of the civilization is made as such, it then habituates people to act that way. There's this, there's this idea, say in more libertarian circles, that if you set people free, they end up in capitalism, or they value things according to the market. Well, someone like Dietrich McCloskey would point out that not even Adam Smith thought that it wasn't freedom that led to wealth, but it was actually wealth that then led to the breakdown of the feudal lords. Because what Adam Smith says, maybe book 7, is that the feudal lords bankrupted themselves on merchant trinkets, could not maintain their lands, and then people were liberated. But the reason why this is very important is because wealth then, and there's more to be said on Dietrich McCloskey, but I'll get to that. We tend to assume that if you increase freedom, you therefore increase productivity. That's kind of the libertarian notion. You set people free, small government, et cetera, so forth, then you get wealth, right? Well, the notion that Adam Smith actually says, that Dietrich McCloskey points out, is that there are actually 2 invisible hands. There's the invisible hands of the market, and there's the invisible hand of people's ethics and values. And that the market actually serves the value. So you have culture is different from market, but if you forego the question of culture, and you let the market do your culturation for you, well, it will certainly give you values. They will just be values in service of, say, disablement, as Ivan Illich talks about, of the fungible commodity form, as Marx talks about, because the beginning of Capital starts with this question of how do you make the commodity intelligible to people. You know, when I look at a bookshelf and I say that's worth $20, where in nature does that say that's worth $20, right? I have to be convinced to value things according to the commodity form. So the overall point, and you can look at Koratani with the structures of world history, Paul Planier, and this is also what Ivan Illich is stressing, is that the question of how people are cultured and how the economy operates are actually separate questions, and the modern world conflates them. We believe that, that market and culture, what market does is liberate people to create their own cultures and their own values, and you don't have to worry about intentionally formulating culture. Well, you look at history, that's not the case. They intentionally cultured people to understand capitalism. They intentionally cultivated people to accept disablement, to accept the trade-off, to actually think that that is rational and that's an increase of efficiency. So if you're not intentional about your values and asking philosophical questions of what is, say, how are we going to spend our time, and is this a good trade-off, to be conscious of all of that, then what you're going to end up is in a world where the market does your valuing for you. You will then lose the freedom to think alternative values and be disabled from even realizing you made that choice. So what Ivan Illich wants to bring to our attention, and you could think of something like I think Charles Taylor talks about social imagination. And I know Matt in his book will talk, I think it's imagicide, is it? The kind of murder of imagination. Well, if we look at economics and Koratani, where there is no imagination, then you're stuck in the mode of economic activity that you have simply absorbed from the system without being aware of it. And so this is the other point to that I think Matt was getting at. If you revolt against the system, let's say you turn down capital, you say, we're going to throw it all out, but you don't at the same time have the institutions or the practices to create an alternative culture, well, then you're just going to fall into chaos. You're just going to eat yourself. And then basically you have the same imagination that gave you that system you just revolted against, and it's only a matter of time before it comes back. And just, you may not even recognize it, but it will just come back around. But you see, this is very interesting then, because it begs the question, all right, where does alternative forms of imagination come from? Where do you get what Koratani would say spirits or new ways of thinking? Where do they emerge from? And that is a question where, again, if we go back and we look at someone like a Randall Collins or Dieter McCloskey, you have to have very intentional spaces outside the market by which people can even imagine different value logics by which to operate, which could look like the communal square, which could look like the church, which could look like the family, which could look like the dinner table. But you have to actively defend those spaces from market logic, because market logic naturally leaks into them and simultaneously trains you to think they should leak into it, right? It presents, it asks you the question, man, you're sitting around the table. Why aren't you increasing business efficiency, right? Like, why aren't you doing it? You could be doing it. Why aren't you? And here's the key point, and then I'll bring it to a close here. Where you have an increase of freedom, you have to make choices on how you spend your time, right? According to, say, your values, right? Every time you make a choice out of freedom, it can feel awkward. Or what if the people around me think I'm lazy? Or what if, like, I'm not as efficient as I could be? Or I could be making more money to take care of my kids, right? You have to ask yourself all of these questions that can make it difficult to resist market logic to defend the space, right? So that, and I should make this point clearer, what you see in history is that markets and culture are created independently. Once capitalism comes in, it tends to logically override the cultural space, do your values for you in order to extend markets. But what Planier wants to show you is that that was an active process that had to make people change what they valued and how they use their freedom to actually align with that market. Well, once that occurs, the issue is, in order to get it back, you have to actively choose to value things that seem like they're impractical, or they're not a good use of time, or they don't have any utility, or all these different things. And that's very difficult to do. And so if we're going to start talking about spaces of cultivating different values, say one that figures out how to have humans exist with nature, not in this kind of idea that nature is harmonious, we need to get rid of humans, but to have humans in a co-laboring, co-creative activity, say, with nature and our own values, and working technology, as Ivan Illich might say, to extend humanity versus replace humanity, then we're going to have to be able to think of values in spaces outside of the market. But that's going to be very difficult to do if we don't have communities who are supporting one another in those free choices, so that we're not overwhelmed by the existential anxiety of wondering why we're choosing these things, and if our neighbors think we're crazy because we're making those choices, say, to focus on beauty or to focus on different values than utility. So there's an effort here also of creating spaces like this where people don't feel crazy if they choose to value things outside the market, and they feel supported in doing that. And then, funny enough, the argument that we were pointing to earlier is actually, if you don't do that, the great joke is that the market, in the name of increasing wealth, actually gets stuck simply oscillating between demand and supply. It can no longer create wealth, and then it actually begins to become pathological, stagnate, and lose wealth creation, leading to all sorts of inefficiencies. And yet it created that very condition of stagnancy because it overrided the common space by which new values could be created, by which to bring in the creation of demand and the creative of new values and alternatives, of which it needs in order to avoid that stagnation. So there's a great irony that's in place in the market overriding and stepping outside of those bounds, because it actually needs those alternative spaces to think creativity that moves beyond a eventually stagnating logic between supply and demand. So I think forming communities that help people in those alternative valuations is really important and increases freedom as such.
Yeah, really well said. My only quick comment would just be to re-bring in the point about ideology, which was part of the framing, which I don't think I mentioned, but I was glad to hear, Matt, you brought that up in your early reflections. So if we're speaking about, and as we often do in the context of Voicecraft, the criticality of the function of the commons, in this case, Daniel's pointing us towards thinking about the importance of participating in, at the very least, recovering, discovering, I'm going to say creating our values, which is creating our values. I'm seeing also from a developmental perspective, in the sense of the values inherent to cosmos, inherent to being as such, are to be realized again by children and by beings as they grow as well. So this isn't necessarily like values straight out the lab with materials that have never before been touched or anything like this. But at the same time, there is something to be said for the particularization of the universal in our time, and that revivification in that sense of valuation, which I think is being pointed to here, which is very important. But it would seem to me in that process, and perhaps part of why the modality of these types of exchanges may be important, is that there's something about the manner by which we can enculture and support the relating with valuation, which can, in principle, and this is a point Daniel and I share in common, Daniel makes very well, pointing to the perhaps need and appropriateness of developing skillfulness in relating as such, in relating with these types of processes, so as not fall prey to ideology, because it would seem to me that one could imagine a space for re-education, or in that sense, participation around the dinner table, that could very much just perpetuate the kind of valuations and logics which are self-similar to what's being identified here as in some sense an encroachment of the market onto that common space. But by that same token, or by a different token, there's plenty of ways in which ideology and the binding to identity can become just as destructive in various other ways through various other kinds of systems. So it feels like, just to re-emphasize, this relationship to the potential for ideology is important. And this is partly where I feel the metaphysical dimension becomes relevant, and why I like to insist on, as a point of anchoring in my own process of communication, of thinking, what does it mean to participate in transformation? It would seem to me how we appreciate and strengthen our shared understanding around what it is to undergo and to participate in creativity as such would be very important here to understand philosophically. And it's precisely the importance of that which draws me to caring about the metaphysics, to caring about the bigger picture, given the importance of what we're discussing and in all honesty, the likelihood of ideology taking over, if we, certainly look at its return again and again in the context of culture over our history. And of course, there hasn't just been that. So that's a little bit of how I'm relating to some of the tensions and energies here, Matt. Of course, you're welcome to follow your own sense of relevance in relation.
Yeah, well, you just had me thinking about the various ways that we can identify and define and inoculate ourselves against ideology. And, what came to me is that, an ideology is anything that prevents you from encountering the otherness and the mystery of other human beings, right? If you're assuming that you already know who someone is, what's motivating them, you're working within some kind of ideological framework that has reduced the mystery of that other to some kind of abstraction, some idea that you have about how human beings behave, and that leads to all sorts of violence often in human history. And ideology also functions to distance us from the creativity, because we think we know more than we know when we're captured by some kind of ideology. I'm thinking about the role of the market in human societies, and there was an anthropologist named David Graeber. He passed away several years ago, who wrote this book, Debt. It came out right around the time that Occupy Wall Street was happening, and he pointed out that markets have always required states. And so you have these libertarian ideologies that think, oh, we got to get the state out of the way. If we just had the market, everything would be great, because it would maximize freedom and so on. And, Graeber's point was, if anthropologically, archaeologically, we look at history, there's never been such a thing as a market without a state. Markets have always required states. I mean, someone's got to enforce those contracts. And one of the approaches to, dealing with our social problems that I continue to study, but it's not just a theory to study. It's a proposal to experiment with and to enact. It's Rudolf Steiner's idea of social threefolding. It's a description of a process that Steiner perceived unfolding over human history, whereby we begin, in ancient civilizations with what Eric Voegelin would call a compact cosmology, where the church or the religion, the market, the state, they're all art. They're all part of the same basic structure, and it's all more or less oriented around some kind of spirituality or religious vision. But over the course of history, this compact form of civilization and cosmology has differentiated itself. And in the modern period, you get very clear distinctions between the political sphere, which is courts, law, and eventually a kind of sense of democratic self-governance, where the rights of individuals and the rights of individuals to associate with other individuals become something we enshrine. And then you have the marketplace, where we engage with trade, with one another via trade, and seek to harness surpluses, again, by applying intelligence to nature. And then you have the cultural sphere, which is everything from art and religion to education, athletics. And in terms of values, this sort of society I would like to see would be one that values cultural production, meaning-making activity, value creation in the sense of not just economic value, but that the values of human connection, the values of beautiful art, of just admiring a very talented athlete, or science itself is also part of this cultural activity, this cultural sphere, where we are curious creatures. We want to understand the universe, and we want to explore and deepen our knowledge. All of this is in the cultural sphere, but when the capitalist market dominates everything, art is reduced, science becomes captured just by the profit motive, and you don't get that open-ended inquiry into the sorts of questions that we're curious about. You get research is funded based on the industrial application that it might have, or the military application that it might have. And on down the line. Everything, I mean, look at all the mega churches here in the US. I don't know if you have that issue in Australia or in Europe, probably not. Everything gets commodified, all of culture. And is there anything left in the cultural domain that hasn't been commodified? We're getting pretty close to the bottom of that barrel. And we've forgotten how to make culture that doesn't have some economic relevance. Like, we really have been de-skilled and convinced that it's of no value unless it's going to earn you something. And that is an absolute catastrophe. But I think, this threefolding idea is really only continuing a process which has been occurring kind of unconsciously, where these spheres are differentiating. And in a capitalist society, the market is dominating too much. In a communist society, it's the state that's dominating too much. In a in a theocracy or fascist society, it's a particular form of culture which is dominating everything else. And we want to avoid any of those extremes. So it's not just, oh, the market is bad. If any sphere takes over everything, it's bad. We need to maintain this differentiation. It's not that the spheres are separate. We don't want to isolate them. And it's not that we want to imagine different classes of people who would work only in one sphere or another. No, this is each human being has each of these capacities. We are physical beings who have needs. We have to engage in the economy, right? We are spiritual beings who engage in cultural activity and cultural life, right? We are beings with rights and responsibilities, and so we engage in politics. Everyone is involved in every sphere. But I think so many of the hot topic political issues of our day that divide our society could be clarified if we acknowledged, in which sphere they lie. And, like abortion, for example, it's a cultural issue, really. But it also, there's the issue of the political rights of individuals, the woman, the child, and how do we work that out? But if we can sort of have this live and let live attitude in the cultural sphere, acknowledging the plurality of different approaches, but in the legal sphere, we arrive at some reasonable determination about when a being becomes an individual and has rights. Maybe we can start to adjudicate these sorts of issues instead of making everything a battle to the death for political power to impose your cultural view as a law on everybody else. And, there are various other issues that we could apply the threefolding vision to in a way to untangle some of these knots.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question here and pass it over to Daniel. Part of the framing that I was writing about yesterday, which again I didn't quite mention, is the question of how we can come to appreciate and accept that which binds us, that which we participate in binding. I appreciate your pointing to the threefold domains there of market state and say culture or commons or arts. It feels like there's something important to highlight in how we relate. What the image I'm kind of getting is there's something in the cultivation of awareness and communication around the mutual appreciation for a multi-layered, say multi-dimensional set of patterns which constitute our homing in a particular context of intelligibility. So I keep bringing up the cosmic just because it would seem to me that part of what is sought here is the kind of capacity for participation that might usually be pointed to in terms of religion or culture, which is capable of bringing to bear the kind of the self-transforming ecologic participation, in a sense, the kind of process of a vital philosophy in a manner that is in touch with the kinds of embedding patterns of transformation at multiple levels, which comprise the life world, which comprise the cosmos. Otherwise, in a sense, perhaps what we're left with is, well, the culture becomes bound by that which we eventually call fascist or ideological in this way or that way. And so, this is where a lot of the work of shamanism, in a sense, in the cultural sense, comes in. Here, Layman Pascal point to meta shamanism. We had a conversation about that, but certainly, just in terms of the shamanic activity of supporting the intelligible participation in that which bridges modes of perception, modes of understanding, perceived concretions of value, and is able to support the harmonization, the participation in which becomes a participation in the transformation of that harmony. You see what I'm trying to point to? I think, OG, would be interesting to pass you. Do you see what I'm trying to point to there is critical?
No, that's wonderful. I'm reminded, and correct me if I'm incorrect with this, Matt, on this idea that Kant talks about beauty as having this kind of somehow overcoming the problem of the bifurcation of being, but then Kant kind of backs off, but Schelling and Whitehead go in. And there's this kind of abysmalness that you have to face if you're going to do that. And I think the issue is now, when we're going to talk about alternative forms of value, there's some sort of abysmalness that we have to face. But if we don't face it, then we can't arrive at, I love the metaphor of thinking about the universe as more vegetative, as more kind of having this vegetative structure to it. Well, there's something you have to die to self to that. There's something where you have to get used to that. You never heard of that, right? Likewise, if we're going to talk about differences between people, then I have to be able to encounter people that are different and go, wow, they arrived at different values than me, and I have my own values, yet I'm still going to hold to mine and grow like the plant I am. And in the same universe, the same soil of this cosmos, they're going to grow in a different way, and that's okay. Well, that's really hard. There's some sort of you have to face something abyssal to open up to creativity, because creativity as a metaphysical principle, if that language suits, has something abyssal to it. Precisely because it is free. That freedom of imagination is precisely what is necessary for creativity. But anyone who's engaged in just an act of creativity knows there's a certain scariness that has to be confronted. But this is all rooted in the encounter between the writer and the piece of paper, or the Christian and the atheist, or the people of different nations. And you have to encounter the other, acknowledge the difference, because the only way to have a common space that could generate different values from, say, the capital nation state, as Karatani says, or in the way that Matt was describing, is to have people able to, in fact, handle the encounter of difference. Otherwise, it will be fascism. I'm going to make everyone think like me, right? I'm going to make all the frickin' plants in the garden roses, because roses are the frickin' best, and I would actually be immoral if I didn't force everyone to be roses, because they are better than morning glory. So actually, ethic compels me into totalitarianism, right? This is how the brain works, unless, one of the things I think that's so important, if in fact you realize that reason, rationality is always already framed by a pre-rational decision. I think someone like Pierce, if I understand it correctly, will talk about adjunction. I'll talk about non-rationality having to come before rationality, common life, Hume, intuition. There are different ways to frame it. Well, once you understand that, well, then you realize it's possible for you to follow what you think is logically and rational best, and to be true to that, and yet someone else can follow their own rationality and end up different, but you actually share the same root of the cosmos, of experience, right? Well, this is all I'd say shamanic, to your point. And also, where are you going to learn about this? Where's this idea even going to come upon you, right? Well, there's something funny enough, what this all suggests, that there's something about philosophy that can train one to be toward the world in this way. Then there's something about philosophy today that is necessary for a common space that is independent of the logic of market capital. Karatani basically says he calls it the capital nation state. He's like, they're all in bed together. Market has always required state. State has always created a nationality to justify it. So the problem is, a lot of people, kind of to the point, a lot of people think that we can get freedom by creating divisions between market and state, or divisions between, market and ideology. But it's all false rebellions, actually. They always end up just refacilitating themselves, and you haven't done anything. Well, that means you have to be working in a space outside of the logic of market, and like a common space, like a community, like we're doing here, right? Philosophy seems to have the possibility of generating the emotional, intuitive, and psychological habituation and skills to be able to handle facing that kind of value creation. Because, a way to put it, and then I'll pass it on. Matt was saying earlier about how the market can almost stimulate, vice is what it tends to sell to, as opposed to, say, virtue. Basically, in an economy, I'll just say capitalism, in a global capitalism that can only stimulate demand as opposed to create demand, to use that distinction I bring out with the general theory of Keynes, then the key ways it stimulates demand is going to be through vice, because you don't tend to have to train people into vice. You can just kind of, present the cheese, if you will. Inventing scarcity. Like Ivan Illich talks a lot about how scarcity is invented to make you worried so that you're participating in the market. That's pretty fascinating. Now, one has to go through the debates between all of the Souls and the Illichs on what scarcity is, but there's this notion that scarcity is what results from intentional disablement, because yeah, if you can't get water yourself, then there's a limited amount of water and you're dependent on the system to preserve it. So the loss of subsistence and scarcity tend to go together. Ivan Illich says, well, that stimulates market activity, the creation of scarcity. And then there's also the commodity form, where the only way you can experience things in the world is as potential things to sell, right? I don't want you to be taken by the beauty of the tree, because you're just going to sit on your porch and be taken by the beauty of the tree. You're not going to be creating utility or selling anything, right? I want you to feel irrational, quote unquote, to not experience the things in the world as participating in the market or a waste of time, right? Well, all of those are means of stimulating demand. But if we're going to create demand, meaning you create your own values, your own demands on yourself for your own life, almost like the Rilke poem, and you must change your life. Well, now we're talking about the cultivation of virtue. And I think Thomas Jockin makes a great case, going classically, where the cultivation of virtue and the ability to experience beauty, the strike of beauty in the Platonic sense, not merely aesthetic pleasure. I associate that with what you were talking about, Matt, with Whitehead and Schelling and Kant and going on and crossing the threshold. Well, that requires a certain conditioning to experiencing that, which is conditioning outside of market logic. There's also an enablement in that. I'm actually enabled to increase virtue, to increase my experience of beauty. Oh, and I'm also able to increase my capacity to enter into flow states or place, parties I don't want to leave, like this, which then, we're not sitting around wanting to go spend something. We're actually, we're quite useless to the market now. And yet in that uselessness, in a sense, there's actually a great joy that comes from that, right? I would have to expand on it, but all of that is the ability to operate according to values that are independent of, say, market valuation. But here's the trick to it. There's something that requires facing something abyssal. There's something where you have to spend your time investing in reading books or doing things that you may not get paid for, and your friends think you're wasting time. You have to be willing to change your views. There's a lot of the Lacanian real, if you will, anxiety that has to be faced to do this. So here's the trick. If we're going to talk about creating alternative markets to the value that creates a distinction between, say, common life, to use a Humean term, and the market, there is some sort of mass training of the average person to handle this anxiety that would be required, and a reform, dare I say, of the education system or the social spaces in which people come to be used to this anxiety. Because pluralism is not merely, having pluralism be embracing this more vegetative notion of the cosmos, if you will, is not merely something where I say to people, you ought to like pluralism, you ought to like diversity. Well, who thinks they don't, right? The issue is the encounter of the other is what brings out the truth. Well, there's a training there, a very practical training, but it's not training for a job training or whatever. It's pluralism training that is something to do with these philosophical tools. And if we don't do it, then you are stuck in the market logic. And the key to realize is the market logic deals with the problem of pluralism. I don't have to understand Islam. I just know that this guy's an engineer. He makes 20,000 a year. I do. We can, market creates a universal language that deals with the problem of pluralism by having everyone operate according to that logic, right? But here's the problem. What is that? Reductionist. And what is this whole thing online? Everyone's talking about causing all sorts of problems. Reductionism. Well, if we want to move beyond reductionism, then we have to be able to handle fullness. And that brings with it a certain dealing with anxiety. But training that is critical for us to be able to create these spaces of an alternative logic. Because the market, the final point is that the market and the state won't maintain that distinction for us. We have to do it. Well, that means we have to own it and choose it and stand by it. Well, that requires a certain training of a certain metaphysical confidence, a certain confidence with others to be able to maintain that space And if we don't want it to be fascist, we have to be able to handle otherness and difference coming into that space with us. But that means we have to be able to handle the other. And that's a training. But if we don't do that, we're stuck under a monolithic value system that will lead to various stagnations of all forms.
Love it. You know, I was thinking when I saw that ad for that horrible AI device of this line from Iris Murdoch that love is the difficult realization that people other than yourself exist. And, you know, going back to this question about what is ideology, the opposite of ideology, I think, is love, actually. And philosophy is the love of wisdom. Plato in his Republic, which I read more as satire than as an actual plan for a city-state, but because it's quite hilarious and comedic, the sorts of proposals that he makes, and he knows he's being funny. And it's even funnier that people read it as a literal plan for a utopian society. Anyways, he says there that, you know, we need philosopher kings to be in charge of everything. Plato, Socrates are kind of down on democracy, which Plato has Socrates say that, you know, democracy is something like a drunken pleasure cruise, which is the shortest path you could ask for to tyranny. And here in the U.S., we seem to be playing that out. But I think democracy is how you would sustain a pluralistic society. And what Whitehead says is that in a modern democratic context, it's not that we don't need philosopher kings and philosopher queens, but everybody must have educational context wherein they can come to love wisdom too. And what is philosophy? Well, Plato has Socrates tell us in the Phaedo, just before he drinks the hemlock, that philosophy is learning to die. And so it is a confrontation with the abyss. And unless we can confront our mortality head on, then we have no idea what is of value in life, and we seek cheap substitutes to distract us from that. The anthropologist Ernest Becker talks about death denial, and so much of our consumer society is rooted on denial of death. How can I fill this void that results from my fear of that fact? Can't take any of these cars and houses and any of this money with you after you die. And so there's this deep wound and emptiness at the core of our consumer society. And it's, yeah, abyssal is the word for it. And I think it's rooted in this death denial. And I see philosophy as a time-tested response to that human situation. And, you know, here we are together philosophizing. None of us are being paid for this, so we're all well off enough that we could do this in our spare time. But it's intrinsically valuable, what we're doing. And I imagine, and I hope some people will listen to this later and find it valuable, not because it has any economic application whatsoever, but just because we're all human beings being towards death, as Heidegger would say. And, you know, we're trying to make meaning together. And, you know, we've lost sight of this core question. What is the human being? You want to bring it back to the cosmic, Tim. The human is a microcosm. And our purpose is to revel in that fact, explore that fact, deepen our relationship to this, you know, larger context within which we find ourselves, which is deeply mysterious. And each one of us as individuals is a microcosm, is the whole universe recapitulated in a unique form. What more could we want with life than to explore that together? It's endlessly fascinating and beautiful. And it's risky too. I mean, none of us is getting out of this alive, right? And so what are we resisting? What are we fearful of? That's a foregone conclusion. We're all going to die. But so much of our economy is just trying to paper that over, as if there could be some meaning we might create that could be maintained without first confronting that fact of our own mortality. We just want to ignore that and pretend like everything's fine. I can fulfill all of my desires with these shiny products, and I don't have to think about death. This threefold social idea, last thing I want to say, is it is a reflection of our human threefoldness, which you can think of in different ways. But, one way of thinking of it is head, heart, hands, right? Thinking, feeling, willing. And, when we engage in our economic life, we're building things, we're engaging our, so all three spheres engage all three parts of ourselves. But in some sense, while we're engaging in the application of intelligence or the head to nature, we're also engaging with our will to transform that environment. In politics, I think it's really about acknowledging this feeling we have for like my own individual rights and the rights of others, and we feel responsible to protect the rights of others. And then the cultural life, we're exploring ideas and thoughts. And so all of this together, this integral human being where head, heart, and hands connect, embedding us in the cosmos. We need these sorts of, I'm kind of describing like a cosmogram here, which would be a deep archetypal symbol around which our whole society could be organized. And we've totally lost sight of that. We've totally lost sight of what it is to be a human being. So yeah, just some thoughts that occurred to me listening, to what you were sharing, Daniel. And in my book, and thank you for reading that, I do end up combining beauty and the sublime. Kant keeps them quite separate. But when you encounter beauty that is infinite, which Kant wanted it to have a finite form, but infinite beauty takes it. That's what the sublime is. It's this infinite beauty that recedes and is just as terrifying as it is alluring. Like you're a moth to the flame, And I think in our contemporary context, beauty has burst the frame, and we have to participate in that abyssal nature and unfold ever new forms of beauty creatively. And Kant was just, I don't know what it was, his pietism or his, I don't want to psychoanalyze Kant, but he just didn't want to dive into it,
Thank you, Matt. Well, he certainly didn't get out there to see the world, did he? As is often spoken about with Kant. So, as you've opened up there to beauty, that felt like a sort of a nice point for an onwards movement in the dialogue, whereas just moments before it felt like you had sort of brought things to a momentary close, and I felt this might be a good moment to summon in Tom to maybe offer some reflections on the dialogue so far. So now he is spotlighted and with us. And so this is really just to open it to Tom to sort of reflect some of what he's been hearing, and with a bit of synthesis, and we'll move into the second half of the dialogue. And take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be summoned. Yeah, thank you, Matt and Daniel. I found this to be quite a touching conversation. The first thing I was noticing was just the tone. Like we were kind of exploring this opening, and I felt like the tone itself was coming from that place, which always feels like a really important starting place. And I think that's what kind of invites us back into culture, is kind of the embodiment of the spirit that we're speaking to. Yeah, and I think one of the core threads that was striking me was this tendency towards a kind of narrowing in a very general sense. Like there's something about some kind of impulse that's within the individual and the collective that if it isn't loved, it tends to kind of close in around something. And it seems to be doing that as a way to perhaps cope. And so I was hearing one of the intervention points on that narrowing is to have spaces like the commons, cultural spaces, where people can begin to kind of melt themselves down into this kind of liminal space and then reconnect with, depending on how you think about this, maybe something that is deeper and more real, or maybe just something that is created but is in touch with its environment. I recently learned that when the caterpillar goes into its kind of goo, the little DNA strands that it rebuilds itself from are called imaginal discs. And I thought that was a really cool name. And it feels like that's what we're calling for here, is relational fields where the imaginal discs are alive and healthy. And there are people kind of stewarding the love in that field to allow people to find their way to those imaginal discs and the ones that are resonant with them. So there is a kind of individuation that is necessary, but like a real individuation that is being coordinated by the forms of intelligence that are far vaster than the ones that the ideologies are constructed from. And so these are like people becoming more person-like. And in doing so, they have a respect for the existing culture and the institutions. So they're not just doing that kind of youthful rebellion that Matt spoke to, which I feel, as you said, there's like a need for that youthful rebellion, but without the like guide of the wisdom of the elder, I think that youthful rebellion is destined to become ideological, because so much of it is spurred from the rejection of the parents and spurred from the pain that the culture inflicted upon that generation. And so there's like the fire of the youth, but it's kind of being mediated by the meta awareness of the elders. And then maybe just a final point, although that's kind of like the intervention is like those cultural spaces, feels like once you've kind of begun to undergo that metamorphosis, you can start creating. And part of that is creating infrastructure and cultural artifacts that have a life of their own and can then play a role in kind of holding that energy in a way that's more sustained. And we don't just have to rely on our soul. We can kind of rely on the context that we're inside of to kind of mirror back to us that love, because that is the consciousness and intentionality that's within those objects. But yeah, thank you both. It's been a really beautiful conversation, and I feel like it's put me back in touch with something really important.
Thank you, Tom. Now I'm going to desummon you, which might make their responses to you, they won't be able to see you, so I don't think that makes sense. But now I've said it, it'd be too. I'm gonna have to do it at some point, or will I? Bloody hell! Desummon. He's gone. Don't come back, you motherfucker.
I can still see you, Tom. I can still see you.
Okay,
You're
good.
tiny.
He's still here.
You're in my heart, right here.
We'll take it away, guys. Or leave it open to the silence.
Well, I loved all that. That was wonderful. I love what you said. I think that's very important. I know Burke also, separates beauty and the sublime, and I think there are some mistakes that come with that. I always kind of like to think, as a little play, you take Lovecraft and you put the craft in parentheses, because in order to have love, you have to risk that kind of being overwhelmed by the abyssal, and if you do, you can turn it into a craft. And we need to think, I think, of the beautiful and the sublime together. The Thanos with the arrows, these things kind of come together. And I think that's very, very important, because if you don't think it, then if you encounter the beautiful in this deeper strike of beauty, as Jockin would say, and it makes you uncomfortable, you may go, oh, this is evidence I shouldn't be doing this, and withdraw from engaging further with the very thing you need to engage further with to be beautiful. So it's very important to have more complicated understandings of beauty. Otherwise, you could interpret the emotional experience in a beauty that would have you withdraw precisely when you are encountering the Beatrix that can lead you on. I've mentioned it before, but I always think that part where Dante's like, Beatrice, why won't you smile? In Canto maybe 19 of the Paradiso. And she's like, well, you know, buddy, at this point, if I were to smile, it would be so overwhelmingly glorious that it would reduce you to ash. So I'm not smiling for your sake until you're elevated to the place of virtue to where you could handle more, actually. And I think that Beatrice structure is actually a very good indication of how beauty works, and actually how you can get a new form of motivation that especially first world nations, after needs have been taken care of, needs to think of. Because basically what ends up happening is, without beauty as this kind of motivating, this kind of meta structure of how humans need to operate, and navigating these tensions between the difficulty, the Lovecraftian, but also the love that moves the sun and stars, and being cultivated to the virtue in time through community to where you can handle it. If that's not a thought in your mind, then you end up having an economy that's not trying to cultivate spaces in which people could be so elevated toward beauty. You continue to try to stimulate them with dopamine or make them take care of needs that they've already taken care of, and you get a certain pathology. If you don't move, I suppose if Dante moves through the Inferno to the Purgatorio and then he gets to the Paradiso, but he's still trying to move through the Paradiso according to the same logic as the Inferno, then he would get reduced to ash by Beatrice. There's a shift in logic for how the socioeconomic system should operate that I think you can kind of, that if you don't shift, you get all sorts of problems. And then basically what we have, like talking more with, like you were saying, when your needs are taken care of, what now? Well, once your needs are taken care of, something that's focused on the beautiful and the virtuous and the valuable, which is an ever developmental process of ever greater complexity, ever greater emergence, that gives you plenty to do. But if that's not even an idea in your head because you've never heard it or learned it, then you would never think to try to live your life according to that, and thus you would continue overfitting the logic of avoiding scarcity or inferno or difficulty, and never ever encounter the love that moves the sun and other stars. So all of that right there is an idea, right? That you need philosophy or communities like this to hear. And if you never heard it, then it would never even occur to you to say, organize your material life or your daily life or your time or your free time in a manner that may realize that possibility, right? And so spreading those ideas and horizons is very, very important. And yet, in order to begin spreading it, you have to have some people or some groups that are willing to operate outside of market logic, that are willing to have those conversations, even if they're not being paid for, and putting it out to the public democratically, not just in specialization. Otherwise, you can't expect to have that reimagining of the world. There's a lovely book that Michelle Bowens told me about called Reimagining the World, Peter Pugnay, and he tries to think of actually economics, taking entropy into account and moving beyond these stable states, equilibrium models that lead to all these pathologies. I think it's very, very good. But one of the ideas of it is, if you want to move to economic thinking that is taking value as pre-market, if you will, pre-economic activity that organizes the whole economic activity, that requires the idea of doing so. And so you need spaces like this that would actually be putting that forth. And basically, this is what I would say. At the beginning, I mentioned this solo residual, which is this incredible point that a very high percentage of wealth creation is due to something beyond capital and labor, right? Basically, my argument would be that a lot of it is the motivation you see in beauty and intrinsic motivation, people looking at the world and tinkering with it, creating things where it's in a useless space they're not being paid for. I would say that that solo residual, a very high percentage of it, is due to spaces outside the market without which the market is not possible. And actually, by denying, the market actually eats itself, eats its environment, and isn't even happier for it. That solo residual is the space in which beauty actually makes a big difference. And you see, it's really funny too, because, you know, we talk about like networks, communities, philosophizing, and like you were saying, Matt, you could spend your entire life, what else do you want to do if, you know, except this sort of thing. What's really funny is when you go back and you look at like a Randall Collins, the sociological theory of intellectual change, you read some of the various biographies of some of the great inventors. You know what they were spending their free time doing? They were just gathering in a bar, having philosophical discussions, and they got so excited about it that they went off and changed science. They went off and invented something. They went off and created a new business, right? You don't see what Julia Benda would call the useless spaces that creates the motivation that makes the modern world. And because you don't see that, and then you are led into a logic of the commodity form, so you lose sight of the origin, almost in a Heideggerian sense. You then try to run an economy without any quote-unquote useless spaces and have it be purely useful and pragmatistic, and the great irony is that then it is not pragmatistic at all. It becomes auto-cannibalistic. And so reclaiming those non-market spaces as being what provide the human motivation that generates the solo residual would actually have you have an economy that doesn't have to act like everything can be kind of like disavow, psychoanalytical disavow, that everything can't be explained purely in terms of supply and demand. It's supply, demand, and creativity, if you want to say. You'd have to own that. And then that would mean you would need to have in your society a real honoring and preserving of spaces like this that make possible the cultivation of subjectivity according to the Lovecraft with the craft in the parentheses toward the beautiful that generates the creativity without which the market eats itself. And if you go through history, that's what you see. And the last thing I'll say is just I think one of the most extraordinary examples. Dietrich McCloskey, he asks a question. So he asks, so what gave rise to the great enrichment starting around 1680 through the 1800s, where the average well-being of the human being on planet Earth just skyrocketed, just really went through the roof. They were living off like 10 cents a day, and then it was $1, and then $5, and really took off, right? And she notes that it's not merely a matter of money, but say air conditioning, access to food, not having to go to war and all these different things. And without going through the entire argument, it's pretty comical. So he says the only way you can explain the great enrichment, which then I do think you could argue ate itself because it fell into the commodity form, and we basically need to reclaim the conditions that gave rise to enrichment that we've lost because we've confused what caused it with what did not. So he says it was basically because around the Dutch Empire, there was a change in how people met and talked with one another. They changed their communal organization. It was a change of what she calls rhetoric. So basically, spaces like this became a defining feature of people in the Netherlands, which then spread over into Britain and then ultimately went over into America, that led to the way that people engage with one another to be one of possibility and creativity and what might we accomplish, of which then felt beautiful to them, that changed their motivation and unleashed them to participate in that creativity that we've been talking about. If that is true, then spaces like this that cultivate that kind of unleashing of rhetoric that McCloskey would say would be one of the best things that we could possibly do. And yet one of the best things we could possibly do is something that seems useless. But as Julia Benda warned us in The Treason of the Intellectual, if universities and colleges are not willing to incubate and create spaces where people can explore the useless, the things you would not be paid for, like philosophy or reading Plato, if it does not do it, and it is taken over by the tyranny of the market, the great irony is that the market would cease to be something that created wealth. It would simply create money. And money that isn't wealth is just pieces of paper. So we have to reclaim those useless spaces, which, funny enough, history shows are actually what generates the creativity anyway. And spaces like this are that. And the more and more people realize that, which the opportunity of this moment is precisely the failures of the system forcing people to ask, is this all there is? When people are forced to ask, is this all there is? They become open to imagining alternatives that they otherwise would not be. And the more and more I think work like this can be done and maintained, the more these kind of spaces and horizons will be available for people to see and thus think, just like we were saying with Beatrice. And once they can think it, they can then change their life. And the beautiful can become the organizing principle by which people seek, as opposed to simply dopamine, which is an increase of awareness, as Simone Weil or Ivan Illich or McGilchrist would talk about, as opposed to merely the garnering of an attention commodity form that's taken over. Indeed, I think a human being that dedicates their life to awareness will have plenty to do and much life to live.
That's very well said, Daniel, but I think we're going to have a marketing problem if we're going to have to start describing this as useless. I think. Yeah, I mean, the thing is about that, it's partly a matter of one's perception of time. That's basically the argument, is actually if you take a deep enough look at things, it's not useless. It's of the very essence of what makes useful possible.
Sure. Well, that's the irony. And, that's how Julia, not to interrupt you, my dear friend, Julia Benda calls it in The Treason of the Intellectual, that the useless is what creates the horizon of even thinking the values of what we consider use. You could call it the pre-utility, without which your utility does your utility for you and eventually leaves you behind. Certainly, I don't think we can have a commercial saying, join us, we're useless. That probably would not be
Yeah.
good unless we had kittens in your cat. If we had those, there's a chance.
Do you know what I mean? If you could sell it, now I think about it, maybe it is. But yes, we basically, pointing to here in some other words that we often use in this context, the dynamics and the criticality, like the fundamentality of the second person field. We could also think about that in terms of ecology, which Matt oriented us towards before. Yeah, no, beautiful. There's a lot I'd be drawn to reflect on. I spoke up just because I wanted to make that addition, perhaps regarding the perception of time, because I do think my sense is it's important to include, and it does speak to some of the criticality from a more pragmatic perspective that we're facing. Cadell Last, who's many time guest of the podcast and also a member of the network, he's having dialogues with a man named David McCarricker, and he will talk about time energy. Now, we all think about time and energy. He's pointing to the way in which current society conditions it so that we do not have the access to the sustained blocks of, in that sense, focused utilization of time and energy that might be so critical for some of what we're discussing here. Certainly, we run into issues as soon as we bring in what it might be to cultivate and open up a sense of our in-timedness and the importance of, in that sense, extending our horizon of care so as to notice, in fact, the value that we are participating in already. We encounter here, on the one hand, that which can orient us and, in a way, sort of transport us into the depths of mysticism and mystical experience. And the most critical of the, the mundane, which really, after all, isn't so mundane, which is the eking out and the building of the possibility. It's kind of one of the reasons, of how we generate the time for ourselves to actually undergo what might be the transformative process in order to open up to new horizons. And so, yeah, that kind of brings in a little bit of what I was initially posing, perhaps not so well in the opening, in terms of what degrees of freedom are open to us, because I am very interested, and we won't be able to get to all of these in the conversation, but just sort of pointing towards what's explored on the podcast in previous episodes as well as ones forthcoming, which really wants to understand some of the constraints. I also like the way that Dave Snowden will point to in what he takes from constructor theory and then repositions as how we can modulate complex adaptive systems. And we'll see that through the lens of transformation by passage and transformation by contagion. No doubt I would have an immediate argument with him over what these things mean, partly just because you mentioned the notion of individuation before, Matt, and this is something that's, I think, very important to build in. Certainly I'm very influenced by Jung, and some of the framing that's implied here for me is important, because I think, in a sense, I suppose if I was to add two more pieces in when mentioning this transformation by passage and transformation by contagion, although Dave does not define them like this at all, and so here I'm totally departing from that, I do think of the functionality of mimesis, and I do think of the nature of ensoulment and the particularization and living of a life as sort of an embodiment of cosmos, the microcosm that you were mentioning, Matt, in the form of individuation as a process. And I think we can support the transformation by passage, or the kind of rituals and contexts within which people can find support in their individuation processes, which is to say, in some sense, their becoming of the kind of being that might, and again, obviously going to be departing a little bit from, it might be some conjecture about this, but to the degree we can become more aware of what we are embedded in and the patterns which comprise us and that which we influence, we might say that this is a mark of maturity. We might say that this is a mark of capacity to enter into a kind of whole-making process with cosmos, and might be demonstrative of a certain coming online of an aspect of wholeness that we could point to in terms of the individuation process. So there's, in a sense, the criticality of cultivating and supporting a real authenticity of being in the world. And then there's navigating the necessity of supporting structures, building structures in the world. And it does seem like one of the very critical ways that people bind to things, and we've touched on this a little bit with ideology, and I'm not trying to reduce transformation by, let's say, contagion or mimesis to something wholly negative. There's something of the educational process, really, and how we model each other, which is, there's a real fire in that catches like a contagion, and it's quite radical to bring up, because this is a kind of influence that doesn't seem as though it's necessarily, I don't know if it's inviting to conscious participation in precisely the same way what it is to participate ultimately in the transformation of oneself. Now, I've muddied the waters quite a lot here. I'm doing it because I feel like, for me, these are really on the pulse of relating with the tensions of everything that's sort of been present. So I'm not making any final statements there with respect to some of what I brought forth, but it's like, I put it this final way. If part of what is necessary is the opening up to a more expanded, deepened sense of time and our embeddedness, then what is being invited is an opening to transformation. And what is often spoken about in this context is that one cannot say to another just what, in fact, the nature of that transformation will be. It has to be undergone in order to be known in that sense. And so there is part of the reason why I think there is resistance. You've mentioned this in terms of the abyssal and encountering the other. Maybe it's just a represencing of that. It's all sort of come through in the conversation, really, those multiple sides of beauty. But there really is at the core of this, there's a fire to tend well. I'm not bringing all those pieces together, and so I'll just bring it to a close and pass it over to you, man. Hey, bloody hell.
It was a firework that was going off, so it's meant to expand the conversation in whatever direction it wants to go. I mean, so many threads here I'd love to pick up on. This importance of the useless and the importance of time that you were just dwelling on, Tim. There's a word that I don't think any of us have mentioned yet: play. It's our capacity to go offline, off the clock, as it were, and engage in play with one another, where creativity happens. And the nature of time, I think of Ben Franklin, right? His famous lines, "Time is money." And I think of William Blake, "Energy is eternal delight." And there's a way in which, in our capitalist culture of just, we feel pressured to be workaholics. When we work for somebody else, we're selling the idea of the labor theory of value. We're selling our labor time. We're selling our very productive capacity to someone else who's making a profit off of that. They're paying us, and there's a whole market for labor, and we hope that people get paid a fair price for their labor. But, Rudolf Steiner would say there's a deep fundamental lie embedded in this idea that an individual could sell their productivity to somebody else. This is our life force we're talking about. And the idea that I might sell that I could somehow separate it from myself and give it to someone else for a price it could only be a kind of slavery. I mean, it's wage slavery. It's not as bad as chattel slavery, but it's still a form of enslavement. My very life capacity, my productivity, my creativity is being taken from me, severed from me. What Steiner would propose is that we don't pay people. What the lie is that we could pay people for their labor time. You don't pay people for their time. Your time belongs to you. It couldn't belong to anyone else. What we pay people for is the products of their labor. But putting that issue to the side, the very nature of time changes. It transforms when we shift from that working mentality to this playfulness. It's out of time, but time still passes in a sense. The clock is still ticking. The days are still turning. But when we're playing, it's as if we're engaged in a form of behavior that is an end in itself. You could say, well, it's useless then. It's not exactly useless. It's just self-justifying, just like beauty is self-justifying. What does beauty get you? Nothing beyond the experience of it. And so play is intrinsically valuable. It's not extrinsically valuable. It's an end in itself. And, I think there's a limit to what policy changes can do to solve these problems. It's a deeper cultural, spiritual transformation that we need. But there was a proposal. I don't know if it was Bernie Sanders who introduced it or if I just heard him talking about it, but 4-day work week seems like a simple enough thing, but it actually opens up longer weekend. I mean, think about how much more spaciousness a 3-day weekend has in terms of just having fun, not worrying about Monday. I actually think, and this is part of the argument for this, that people would be far more productive in those 4 days of the week if they had 3 days to play, But again, I think even more fundamental is getting away from this labor theory of value that you can sell your labor time. There's something deeply perverse about that. And I think we need to really examine that. Because, when we're working, we're going to be stuck in a groove. We have a job to do. We have expectations to meet. We have boxes to check. There's no creativity that's going to come out of that. Right. And so we're selling our productive capacity and we're just channeling it into somebody else's mold versus feeling like we can explore our own creativity as an end in itself and engaging cooperatively with others as we explore that. I think it really does. It's not like this would harm the economy or in any way stifle growth and productivity. It would unleash it. And then just one last thing on this question of mimesis. It's an inescapable part of being human. Monkey see, monkey do. And on some level, though, earlier, Daniel, you were talking about how, people need to be enculturated, like to value ideas and to think that just sitting around and philosophizing is worthwhile. That there's a certain amount of training that's required for that. And of course, that's true. But I think also a large part of education ideally would be allowing the curiosity, the wonder, the creativity of children to flower instead of filling them with information. They already know on some level how to be creative, and we can foster that instead of, again, stamping them with the mold so that they're pliant workers. But there's another kind of mimesis, maybe we call it cosmic mimesis, where, primal peoples observed the sun and witnessed this generosity, this ceaseless prodigality, where they're noticing the sun is ripening the harvest, warming them, all for free. It's giving without expectation of return. And that is a lesson that the mimesis there, solar mimesis, if you want, is in some sense, it's the basis of all of our religions, that the wisdom of the world religions is just observing what's going on in the natural world around us and translating that into culture. Right. And so in some sense, there is guidance here, and mimesis need not be a producer of ideology. It can also free us from that.
Yeah, that's very important to clarify. I'm glad you did. So, Daniel, can I ask you to bring things to a close now, just as we look to wrap up within our time, and then we'll see what follows. But just to be respectful of that, part of what's coming to mind there, we've often spoken about in terms of exemplification. That might be one way you might take this or not. I think that's a beautifully made last point, Matt. So yeah, Daniel, how would you bring things to a close for this dialogue?
Well, the very fact that time has gone so quickly and there's been a transformative experience of time is an indication of value. And I think that emphasis on time being not an illusion, but somehow foundational, that it has this kind of life to it through your work, that is an indication of one of the great ways to determine value outside the commodity form, the experience of time. How time, when it speeds up, and where do the hours go? That's an indication of value. And if we can value different experiences of time, not merely different experiences of place. I visited a cool place. Like, there's a lot of experientialism that actually is a new commodity form because you're taking pictures of all the cool places you're traveling. I think the experience people are hungry for is actually that experience of time, 2 hours going by and you don't know where it went. And that's something that good discussion does. I think of the individual thinking fast and slow. Daniel called me his coworker. They'll talk about how, 8 hours went by in conversation. They didn't even realize that. And you see that in the liminal web. And I think that is an experience of beauty that actually speaks to the most powerful form of human motivation. Like, motivation is so aligned. Human activity is so aligned that all this time goes by and you don't even realize it and you feel energized. I love that you brought in play. I think that's exactly right. And I think play is a good way. The great funny thing is we think of play and work as opposites, but actually when you have play in this way, who knows what sort of productivity? Like, play is basically, again, there's all these kind of points in economics where they're like, I don't know where demand comes from. Marx starts the capital action like, well, people just want things. Okay, well, why? It's like, well, we're just going to assume it. Demand's just there. Is it? There's this like 20 to 50% of the economy that just like we can't even model. I would argue a lot of that is play. When the economy is actually productive, when people actually have those experiences of that freedom. And it makes me think of leisure, Joseph Piper and different things, and leisure as this new occupation of time. And there is very good reason, ironically, to think that actually there is no, let's put it this way, there is no necessary correlation between how much you work and how much wealth the economy creates. You can work a whole lot, 7 days a week, actually. There are many nations, unfortunately, that do that, and they're not necessarily rich. There is not a necessary correlation between the selling of your labor and the wealth that's produced. There are other factors going on. Marx in the Capital says that if you go and dig a hole in a field, that's not actually labor because nobody wants to exchange it, right? You can go work in a field, but if it's not part of the market, it's not labor. I think that's a really important point, though, because it suggests that the modes of exchange determine the difference between work and labor. And the architect of the society and how it formulates people to think not merely informs them how to think, but it creates the kind of incubator of their habits and how they act, determine how they want to exchange with one another, of which then defines the difference between labor and toil, that then determines what exactly creates value. Well, what if people wanted to exchange philosophy, ideas, and beauty? That would be a form of labor that is actually not the toil, that doesn't even have a necessary correlation with creating wealth anyway. And if we look back on history, we actually see when people exchange with one another in the network structure or in terms of rhetoric, you actually get more wealth. ironically. And so I think that point on the possibilities of a 4-day work week are very, very important. And because in that space of, as Julia Benda says, useless, and again, he uses that term as a critique of the paradigm of utilitarianism that is taking over. And so he's countering that and saying we need spaces of thinking values alternative to utility or will be a slave to utility. Ironically, in that space of the weekend, that's where you can say, what do I value? What exactly am I working for? And the more you can think that, the more that you can be free and the more that can open up. And then ironically, the higher the probability of a great enrichment. And so my closing thoughts would be, I think that's a very good point, Matt, that actually you see in children a desire to play. You see this kind of wonder that is already in existence. And in the sense that people can need training, what we need is guides to facilitate an already unfolding creativity that we see in people that they tend to forget with time or get trained out of. But that is a matter, and this is where I think sociologists on the role of aesthetics, form versus information are very, very important. That is a matter not of the information you tell people, but in the way they relate to information and they relate to one another. Taking a test on Plato is different than talking about Plato. Taking a test on what you think is beautiful or taking pictures of beauty is different from the experience of beauty that makes time speed up and you don't know when went by. We need to emphasize education in terms of formulation, which formulate the subject to have different horizons of experience versus information. The classroom, as Neil Postman talks about, a person in the front who's telling the kids what to think and who answers, it's a trivia game. And Neil Postman says we need to take the medium as the message notion from McLuhan and apply it to the classroom. You basically are formed by the classroom, regardless of the information, to participate in an industrial economy, to listen to the boss and to sell your labor. Well, if the classroom formulated you to unfold creatively, to actually incubate the wealth that takes care of that soul residual, then actually we would have a better economy, happier people, and people that would actually be unfolding in such a way that they have more experiences of value, meaning more experiences of time, where time just slips by like that, and you don't know what went by, but you want to do it again because you find life in it. You find a certain participation with things. The more and more people taste that, and that can be a matter of seeing it, that can be a matter of people growing desperate, looking for alternatives. And the more and more, because there is in that question you asked, Tim, a question of how do societies change? That's a sociology question. There's a book by James Hunter called To Change the World, which is an examination of when societies transformed in their values. You have someone like a Pierre Bourdieu who talks about distinctions and the role of people seeing alternatives that they associate with logic and what they should do. There's an entire sociological paradigm in operation. And there's also the notion that when the economy fails and everything hits a fan, then people say, maybe we should do something different out of desperation. So there's desperation, there is the example, there's the formulation, and there's an experience of beauty. And the more and more the people who are offering those cultural alternatives can stay faithfully present to the process and do so in a manner that connects with forces that economically sustainable forces, faithful presence, political operations, and people see that alternative, the more and more people want to invest in it, and the more those things can spread. And I think the hope in it is precisely the fact that when you see children, they seem to know what creativity is. They seem to know what play is. And if that's what you see in the average child on examination, then there would be reason to think that the majority of people have that capacity of wonder that, if put in a place of formulation, would give rise to the possible habits of them continue to unfold that way. As Picasso says, the trick is staying a child. If you could do that, that actually would open up these new possibilities of relation to the economy and the capital nation state and in ourselves. But that's a matter of formulation, of different ways of seeing people interact with ideas and information. And I think that is something that's being exemplified here in Voicecraft, the liminal web, and more people, because what you see here is your entire life you were told at college, you should do learning for learning's sake, right? That's really important. You should seek ideas for their own end. Okay, well, you go off to Rustburg, move away from a college. It's kind of hard to find people that read Hegel or Deleuze or different things, right? It is now possible to engage in a social coordination mechanism, like a pricing mechanism, thanks to this technology of Zoom, the liminal web, and YouTube, that actually creates the infrastructure for the possibility of lifelong learning, as opposed to you just have to live around a college and stay in the geographic area. In offering this social coordination infrastructure, I think there is the possibility of incubating the continued participation in that childlikeness by which beauty and intrinsic wonder can be known. It's simply implementing this infrastructure, perhaps having transformations in education and various capital flows to make possible this expansion, but that's part of the faithful presence in the work.
And if you would like to hear more on that, you can get the book by O.G. Rose, Belonging Again, and Address. And no, that was, yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much to both of you. So let's bring it to an end here. And I'll keep the recording button on just because people might want to stick around. Yeah, and then maybe we'll share whatever follows just to the network. Potentially, there could be a way to do it. But yeah, but to also, you know, give you the opportunity here, Matt, as well. We've reached the 2-hour mark, so I'll remove these highlights.
This has been so much fun. Yeah, really great to really get a chance to be in dialogue with you, Daniel, and appreciate Tim for hosting, and Tom, appreciated your contributions, and it's nice to have a captive audience as well. You know, and I just want to share though, when you were talking, Daniel, it occurred to me that wonder is basically surplus attention, and education is an opportunity to create the spaces whereby we can maintain that surplus.
Absolutely, absolutely.
If we're not engaged in lifelong learning, attention becomes quite a scarce commodity, and indeed becomes commodified, and so it's all about keeping the wonder alive. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, I just want to say I've really enjoyed speaking with you. And I was thinking while going through Crossing the Threshold, how much I wish in college when, you know, the tyranny of this overgeneralization of entropy or kind of stuck in these bifurcated metaphysics, how difficult that was to swallow, and how much it would have benefited me to have had a text like that. And I think it's very elegant. I think it's very clear. I think that work is very, very important. And I really do stress, I really do think that there is space in, like, economics is in massive trouble, sociology, all of these different things, without that mode of thinking coming in, and it can make a huge difference. And I love what you just said on surplus. If we overly think about economics as being about scarcity, it's like overemphasizing entropy, like you said. So of course it becomes a stable state that eats itself. But surplus is a real value that lifelong learning can generate. And if people have a metaphysics like what you present to think that that describes reality and align with it, lifelong learning and a creative cosmos go together, and now we have the infrastructure, the practical infrastructure by which to coordinate that lifelong learning. Well, this opens new possibilities of emphasizing surplus in human affairs, not just an organization of scarcity, and furthermore, in coordinating with people such as yourself who are entering into these conversations, then people can see, oh wait, there are other people doing that. And it becomes a social exemplar by which you then have a spread of mimesis for the wonder and the surplus, as opposed to instead just seeing everyone being embarrassed about talking about their interest in philosophy, unless they're going to become a professor. So they keep it hush. Nobody knows about that, and you're under the tyranny of scarcity.
All right. Well, I'm keen to take on this question of surplus in terms of contribution. If you speak about education, got to talk about contribution as it relates to belonging. I do think that, and then back into the pragmatics of how we meet the challenges.